Hi there, my name is Gareth Haysom and I'm a researcher at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. Within this food politics theme, I'm going to try and understand the roots of food poverty in South Africa and really unpack the South African food system and its origins and why we have a system we have today. I think it's particularly important in trying to then understand or think through how we kind of try and imagine a post-COVID food system and what that might mean. For me, food security is a useful way of trying to understand the consequences of a food system at this point in time. And food security has been defined since the mid-1990s as a situation that rests on 4 dimensions. That there's enough food available, that food can be accessed either through the market or exchange or through networks, that food can be utilized in a way that aids nutrition, but also that there is stability within the food system. There's quite a profound shift as is taking place quite recently in how this is framed. The high-level panel of experts at the FAO have inserted a further 2 dimensions to this. One is sustainability, which one might say is obvious, but certainly trying to think through both the short term in terms of stability, but also the long-term stability of the food system. But another component to this is agency. I think agency is particularly important in terms of how one finds voice within the food system and how one acts and changes and tries to transition to a different kind of food system. And I like to try and frame agency in a way that I borrow here from Embry and Misha in terms of understanding agency as this constant dance between where we are now and trying to imagine a better future, so thinking about the future, but at the same time constantly drawing on the past to try and understand what the past has created and what it's provided us with, and then try and act on what we're dissatisfied or what we want to change about the present in terms of how we then move into the future. And so this sort of iterative dance between these 3 different places is particularly important. I don't think we necessarily give enough credit to the past and history in trying to think through how the future might play out, and that's going to be one of the kind of components of this talk. But it's important to understand where we were before we went into COVID and what the situation looked like. This is work that we did at the Hungry Cities Partnership, where we sort of did a survey across the whole of Cape Town, as representative as one can be, given the nature of how people and how surveys might play out. But we found, when we divided up amongst income quintiles, severe inequality and high levels of food insecurity in the lower income quintiles of 1, 2, and even 3. And if one looks at this, there's no surprising that so many people fell from food insecurity into hunger when COVID hit. But not only around food security, the levels of dietary diversity, so the HDDS score as they call it, was particularly low in those low income quintiles. And where 6 is seen as a proxy indicator for undernutrition. So one can see that level of that. But not just food insecurity, you also start to see very poor diets tracking almost all the way through to even the 4th income quintile. But we also see very unstable food system where for the lowest income quintiles, almost 5 months of the year, people are worrying that they're going to be able to get enough food. So this reflects the vulnerability of Cape Towns to food insecurity and hunger, but it highlights how flawed the South African food system actually is. But COVID came, and as Bill Mosley describes it, it engages kind of, or processes through what he calls hierarchical diffusion. This means that it enters into cities, often the places of economic activity, and then spreads from there. And when it came into the South African cities, it hit the cities hardest, and our food system and the virus interacted in ways that I don't think we necessarily anticipated. So the highest level of mortalities, etc., or certainly the food system impacted on mortalities severely in terms of diabetes and hypertension. What we learned from this process was that the centrally governed food system was inadequate to respond to the right to food and provide the necessary nutrition that we need, but that there was also a misalignment between food security policy and the realities of the lived South Africans. And that was most evident in the lockdown regulations, where the kind of food system that was imagined by a national government and all their advisors from the private sector and the whole set of researchers, etc., almost imagined a formal food system as the food system that most South Africans used. What we're seeing now is these calls for fundamental changes to the food system across multiple scales. And Jennifer Clapp has kind of argued for this rethinking around the infrastructure that governments provide to create more local production, processing, markets, etc. whereas IPES, the food group that does fantastic work, is really calling for fundamental food system transformation and the need to kind of enable that transformation to create resilience at all levels of the food system. What we're seeing also is fantastic solidarity coming together. I've just used Cape Town Together and the CAN networks, but there have been faith-based groups, there have been multiple soup kitchens and others that have been created to enable this kind of respond to the crisis. But I have a question that sits here around this, is that why, if food security was so dire, are we only seeing this now? And is there something more systemic at play? And I would say definitely yes. And here I draw on the work of Rob Nixon and his work where he uses the term slow violence. And he describes slow violence as this unseen, often private, inequality driven suffering that is encountered so many people in Cape Town and South Africa. And I would say that the slow violence is an outcome of this highly unequal food system that we have. And the fact that slow violence is experienced in deeply private and incremental and accretive ways means that it's so often invisible. And I would like to argue, and this is the point of this talk, that this violence, this slow violence, is in fact intergenerational. It has been with us for a very long time. And we're trying to imagine a new and a different kind of food system. We do need to go back and try and understand the DNA that sits within that system that has created what I would say is this normalization of food poverty. Because if food insecurity is so high, why haven't we seen food rebellions? Why haven't we seen food becoming political? It becomes political when there's hunger, but it hasn't been political for so long. Other things, like sanitation, housing, are often very political, but food isn't. And so why is that, and what sits within that? And the answer to that question emerged in response to a respondent in a survey that we were doing in Zambia, actually, where he said, if I've had Nshima, if I've had Sadza, Ugali, Pap, Maputo, I've eaten. And this notion that a single staple denotes being satiated. It means that one has eaten. And I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that people are saying that this is what their food is out of ignorance or laziness, as a lot of responses to food security often argue. That's certainly not the case. People are highly strategic in the choices they make around food, and they certainly understand what good nutrition is. But the system has kind of created this trajectory in which the single staple becomes the exemplar, or shows what one has eaten, in fact. And here I found it particularly useful to go back in history and see what people were arguing when they were really trying to understand another crisis, which was the formal enactment in the late 1960s of apartheid. And they were trying to understand what this meant for a variety of systems. And this was particularly the agricultural system, but it was particularly useful. And really what I would like to argue is that our current food system has its origins in the discovery of diamonds and gold, and how that prompted a complete restructuring of our society and our economy. It led, as Colin Bundy has argued, this dispossession of land in order to create an urban and low-paid labour force, and the associated laws and taxes and things that enabled that. It also called for a restructuring of the agricultural economy with a privileging of a particular class of farmer, the white farmer. We also saw that this was informed by the industrial policy and the secondary industrialization that took place, which meant that we needed to have in South Africa low-paid industrial labour force in urban areas. And one of the core instruments to enable this, and the passivity of this passive, low, urban labour force that wasn't ever going to get hungry, but wasn't necessarily going to be well fed, was through the industrialization of the maize economy. And so these writers back in the 1970s certainly argued this in many ways. But as Stephen Greenberg has more recently argued, that these foundations oiled the transition of South Africa's food system to what we have today. The spatial and other sort of disenfranchisement meant that it accelerated the industrial transition that we have. And we saw that in the fact that South Africa was one of the first adopters of supermarketization and embraced it wholeheartedly. And the fact is that most people, and for quite a long time, both rural and urban, have been fed by these consolidated corporate entities. And just the figure there on the slide shows the sort of complexity of that corporate ownership. Another point of evidence in this is the work by Jane Battersby and others showing the supermarket expansion from 1994 in South Africa, in Cape Town. The darker squares are the wealthier areas, and you start to see that in 2003 and in 2013. So the proliferation of the supermarkets in this formal system as it played out. So for me, I ask if these notions of a kind of transition to sustainable and local food systems are not a little bit idealistic, particularly if we're not kind of thinking about these origins and this history. And for me, a far more reflective engagement is required, engagement that considers deeply and acts on the structural racism in the system, the deep injustices, and the intergenerational disenfranchisement that has come before. For me, local and sustainable food systems will not be possible, despite their significant importance, and it's certainly what we need, unless we proactively engage and dismantle and disentangle the historical foundations of our food system. The social capital that has been built up over COVID gives us the potential to start having these difficult conversations and to think about how we even try and dismantle the perceptions around what a good food system might be, and these perceptions that reinforce the status quo. And so I'd like to argue that we cannot simply call for change. We really need to be far more proactive in thinking about the origins of our food system and thinking about how we disentangle that. I don't have the answers, but we need to be far more active in that and not just accept that as a given. It can be undone, it was created, and it needs to be undone. So with that, I say thank you very much, and I look forward to some very interesting questions in what comes further in these food dialogue sessions.